Nicolas Cage didn't just play broken men. He made the world feel what it's like to fall apart and keep breathing. From the Oscar-winning despair of Leaving Las Vegas to the unhinged brilliance of Face Slash Off and the relentless drive of National Treasure, he didn't act. He exposed something raw, something dangerous, something real. He walked away from privilege, tore his own name apart, and rebuilt it with nothing but obsession and scars. But here's what the spotlight never told you. What if the chaos you saw on screen wasn't performance, but survival? What if every role was a confession hiding in plain sight? Now at 62, after everything he's gained and everything he's lost, Nicolas Cage is facing a truth success could never erase. Some scars don't heal, they sharpen. And if you believe that Nicolas Cage is one of the most talented legends in the history of cinema, leave a like as a gesture of tribute to the man who dared to walk through fire and rise once more. What happens when a home looks intact, but never truly feels safe? For Nicolas Cage, the damage did not arrive in a single moment. It settled in quietly, long before he had the words to understand it. He was born Nicholas Kim Coppola on January 7, 1964, in Long Beach, California, the youngest of three brothers in a family rich in intellect and artistry, yet fragile in peace. Outside, late 1960s, California pulsed with music, rebellion, and sunlight. But inside the Coppola household, the rhythm broke without warning. His father, August Floyd Coppola, a literature professor at Cal State Long Beach, lived through structure, language, and discipline. A man who could explain the world, but not always soften it. His mother, Joy Vogelsang, a dancer and choreographer, could be luminous one moment and painfully distant the next, were her emotions drifting between brilliance and a quiet, unreachable sorrow. There was beauty in her, Cage would later say, his voice steady but restrained. But there were parts of her I could never reach, no matter how close I stood. The house held that contradiction in every breath. The scent of old books, perfume, coffee, fading roses, and something heavier that never had a name. Some days felt warm, others felt suspended. He would sit near the door as a boy, not playing, not speaking, just waiting. Waiting for footsteps. Waiting for proof that everything was still okay. Sometimes nothing came. No voice, no movement, just stillness stretching too long. That was the fear, not what happened, but what didn't. I didn't understand what I was feeling, he later admitted. But I just knew something inside the house was wrong, even when everything looked calm. Because in that home, quiet did not mean safety. It meant uncertainty. It meant anything could shift without warning. When he turned 12, that tension finally gave way. The marriage that once held intellect and passion together unraveled without noise, leaving behind not chaos, but absence. His parents separated, and the house did not fall apart. It emptied. My father gave me logic. My mother gave me emotion, he would reflect years later. And I've spent my life trying to survive between the two. That fracture did not stay in the home. It stayed in him. He learned to stay still, to watch closely, to feel everything, and show almost nothing. Not because he was calm, but because he had learned something too early. When emotions are left unguarded, they can disappear. After the separation, his father brought structure, routine, expectation. His mother remained, but like a signal fading in and out, often gone for long stretches, leaving behind a love that felt real, yet unreachable. Loneliness did not arrive. It stayed. At Beverly Hills High School, he tried to dissolve into ordinary life, but his last name refused to let him. Coppola. It carried weight and suspicion. Classmates whispered that his future had already been written, that whatever he became would never truly belong to him. He didn't fight it. He changed. A leather jacket, dark glasses, a new name, Roy Richards, not to stand out, to survive. The laughter faded, but something deeper took its place, a need not just to hide, but to define himself on his own terms. That need led to a final, irreversible choice. When Nicolas Cage, a name drawn from John Cage and Luke Cage, symbols of artistic freedom and inner strength. It wasn't reinvention. It was defiance, a quiet refusal to live inside a name he didn't choose. For the first time, he chose himself. And somewhere inside that long, unspoken struggle, he found the one place that did not reject what he felt. Acting. Watching James Dean in Bruce Lee, he recognized something immediate and undeniable. Pain, not suppressed, but transformed. Emotion, not controlled, but released. At 15, the realization settled in. Quietly, permanently, what had hurt him could become his voice. "I didn't want to escape my feelings," he once said. "I wanted to understand them, and then give them somewhere to go." Every unanswered moment, every empty doorway, every fragment of love that never fully arrived, he carried them all, not as burden, but as source. The boy who once waited in stillness did not leave that place behind. He learned how to speak from within it. And years later, when the world watched him, intense, unpredictable, fully alive in every role, they were not just seeing performance. They were seeing memory, shaped into something visible. Because Nicolas Cage did not become an actor to escape what he lived through. He became one, so that what was once unspoken would never remain unheard again. Pain doesn't let go. It follows you until you can't breathe. And when you think you've escaped, it finds you again. For Nicolas Cage, what followed him wasn't noise, but a quiet that kept changing form. Rejection, hunger. Nights that stretched too long in borrowed rooms where the ceiling became something to stare at, not sleep under. Outside, Los Angeles flickered, neon bleeding into glass, laughter spilling onto sidewalks. But none of it reached him. The distance stayed. "I carried it with me," he would later say, almost under his breath. "I just knew. If I didn't turn it into something, it would swallow me." At 17, he let go of the Coppola name, not stepping into freedom, but into exposure. No safety, no shortcuts, just survival. Apartments came and went. Some nights, when there was no bed, just a floor that held the cold longer than it should. Other nights, a car. The engine stayed on, not to go anywhere, just to keep the cold from settling into his bones. He worked whatever came, sweeping empty stages, lifting equipment no one thanked him for, chasing small jobs that barely covered the next day. And when the city finally went quiet, he spoke into the dark. Lines half whispered, again, again. Not to perform, just to hear himself exist. "I didn't want the name," he once said. "I just wanted a chance to be real." But reality then meant disappearing in plain sight. One more face passing through a city that didn't notice who stayed and who broke. At the Fairfax Theater, he stood behind a counter, handing popcorn to strangers while watching other lives unfold on the screen. Light flickered. Faces filled the frame. Applause came easy, just never for him. The smell of butter and burnt sugar stayed on his clothes long after the shift ended, a quiet reminder that he was feeding other people's dreams while his own waited in the dark. When a small role came in, The Best of Times, 1981, it barely landed. Then came Fast Times at Ridgemont High. He sat in the theater, watching, waiting. The scene approached and passed, not trimmed, not moved, gone. No name, no moment, just light on the screen and nothing of him in it. I remember thinking, maybe I'm not meant to be here, he would admit years later. That thought didn't break him. It stayed. And after that, rejection wasn't a surprise anymore. It was expected. Something repeated enough stops feeling temporary. It starts to feel like truth. When Francis Ford Coppola offered him Rumblefish, he stepped in carefully, not as family, but as someone determined to earn space without protection. Then came the decision that cut him free from everything familiar. Coppola became Cage, not a reinvention, a refusal, a name drawn from John Cage and Luke Cage, symbols of freedom, defiance, control. From then on, nothing would be given. Everything had to be taken, proven, survived, and he pushed himself further than most ever would. For Birdie, 1984, he had 2 teeth pulled, no anesthesia, just to understand pain without distance. For Racing with the Moon, He lived alone in a cold trailer, eating canned food, stripping life down until comfort was no longer part of it. People called it extreme. He didn't argue. "I wasn't chasing fame," he said quietly. "I was trying to find something that felt true." Every role became a line he had to cross, again and again. And slowly, without announcement, something shifted. The same person who once swept empty floors began standing under lights that stayed on. But nothing about it felt sudden. What the world saw as arrival was built from nights no one witnessed. From hunger, from silence, from moments where stopping would have been easier. The emptiness never disappeared. It just found direction. Because Nicolas Cage was never driven by comfort. He was driven by what refused to heal. And that is why the fire in him never went out. It wasn't built from success. It was built from everything that tried to erase him and failed. Applause doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it sounds like something breaking. For Nicolas Cage, that sound first rose in 1987, when Moonstruck lit up theaters and audiences leaned forward, unable to look away. Acting beside Cher, his energy wasn't controlled. It was alive, unpredictable, almost dangerous, turning a simple love story into something electric. "That was the first time I felt truly seen," he would later say. But recognition came fast. Too fast. Lights, interviews, laughter, all of it closing in at once. And underneath it, something fragile beginning to slip. The quiet he once knew, the one that protected him, was gone. 3 years later, he came back sharper, louder, harder to ignore. Wild at Heart 1990 wasn't just a performance. It was a collision of chaos and tenderness that won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. Critics called it reckless. Audiences called it real. Cage didn't perform, he surrendered. "I started to understand that truth isn't always calm," he said. "Sometimes it looks like madness." But the higher he rose, the less air there was to breathe. By 1995, leaving Las Vegas demanded something deeper. Not technique, but exposure. As a man collapsing into addiction, he didn't act the role. He let it consume him. "I wasn't playing him," Cage would later admit. "I was losing myself in him." When he stood on the Oscar stage, flashes exploding, the room roaring around him, something inside stayed quiet. For a second, he questioned everything. Is this success or survival? The applause was deafening, but it didn't feel like celebration. It felt like grief wearing a mask. Then came the explosion. The Rock, 1996. Con Air, 1997. Efface/Off, 1997. Films that didn't just succeed, they detonated across the world. The man who once slept in his car was now earning $20 million per film, his name blazing from Los Angeles to Tokyo. Hundreds of millions at the box office. Headlines, power, momentum. But nothing slowed down. 20-hour shooting days. Explosions echoing through sets. Nights where sleep never fully came. Scripts clutched under flickering trailer lights. Some evenings he would sit alone, shoulders shaking slightly, the smell of smoke and sweat still clinging to him, whispering lines into the mirror. Not to practice, but to remember who he was. "I was everywhere," he said once, almost quietly, "but I couldn't find myself anywhere." The camera loved him. The world consumed him. And slowly, frame by frame, he began to disappear. In 1998, when City of Angels softened everything on the surface. No guns, no chaos, just a being willing to fall from eternity to feel something real. It mirrored something deeper. A man surrounded by everything, yet reaching for something he couldn't name. "I thought I was playing an angel," he later reflected, "but I was searching for something human." The film moved millions, but left him emptier than before. Then came the fractures. Snake Eyes stumbled. Captain Corelli's Mandolin, 2001, collapsed financially. Losses stacked, not just in numbers, in meaning. Each failure left a silence heavier than the last. And still he didn't stop. When National Treasure arrived in 2004, it roared past $347 million worldwide. rebuilding him into one of Hollywood's wealthiest stars, his fortune climbing toward $150 million. From selling popcorn to selling out theaters across the globe, it should have felt like a rival, but it didn't. Because long after the lights fade, what remains isn't applause. It's what you hear when you're alone. There were nights, 3 a.m., hotel rooms high above cities that never slept, where he would stand at the window, glass cold beneath his hand, looking at his reflection split between shadow and light. The legend, and the boy who never stopped searching. Nicolas Cage had conquered Hollywood, but the cost didn't show in headlines. It lived in the quiet moments no one filmed. Every cheer, every flash, every success proved he had reached the top. But somewhere along the way, something essential had thinned out. And as that golden era slowly dimmed, one truth remained. Not soft, not comforting, but real. Greatness doesn't come without a burn. And sometimes what makes you shine is the very thing that takes pieces of you away. Success doesn't collapse all at once. It fractures under weight until there's nothing left to hold. For Nicolas Cage, the fall didn't begin with failure, but with excess. There was a time when the world moved around him. Cameras chased him. Awards filled his hands. By the early 2000s, he stood at the peak, an Oscar on the shelf, over $150 million to his name, a presence so powerful it could shift entire box offices. He didn't just appear in films, he ignited them. Studios lined up, scripts arrived like promises. And yet, beneath the weight of all that gold, something began to bend. Because the higher he rose, the heavier everything became. At first, it felt like momentum, applause, constant motion, success that never seemed to slow down. But when the noise faded, something else rushed in to take its place. Not peace, pressure. And he answered it the only way he knew, by spending. More houses, more things, more distance from whatever he didn't want to face. He bought without stopping. Mansions that stretched into the sky. A Gothic estate in New Orleans, rumored to be haunted. A centuries-old castle in England. A private island in the Bahamas. Not one home, but many. Garages filled with machines he could barely drive. Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, rare cars sitting untouched under covers. He spent millions on things most people would never even imagine owning. Dinosaur skulls, meteorites, rare comics, pieces of history, bought like trophies. It looked like power. It felt like control. But it was something else entirely. A man trying to outrun something he couldn't name. There were mornings when sunlight spread across marble floors in empty rooms no one lived in. Afternoons where space grew so wide it felt hollow, and nights where laughter echoed once through those massive halls, then vanished, unanswered. Everything was filled, every room, every garage, every space, except him. Then everything cracked, quietly at first, numbers that didn't add up, deals that didn't hold, money slipping away faster than it came, and in 2008, the illusion collapsed. The crash didn't knock, it hit, hard. The IRS filed a $6.3 million lien. Properties turned into listings, the castle, the island, the New Orleans house, gone. One by one, sold off under the cold rhythm of an auctioneer's voice. He stood and watched as pieces of his life were carried out. Paintings, instruments, artifacts that once defined an era. At one point, a framed photograph slipped, shattered across the floor. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at the broken glass. His reflection split, uneven, unfamiliar. For a moment, there was no headline, no narrative, just a man who no longer recognized what remained. They called it the fall of a king. But kings don't fall loudly. They disappear in stages. He said nothing, no excuses, no retreat. I got myself into this, he said quietly. I'll find my way out. So he did the only thing left. He worked, not strategically, relentlessly. 4 films a year, sometimes more. Big studios, small indies. It didn't matter. Work became survival. There were nights he filmed until sunrise, then drove alone through empty highways, stopping at roadside motels where the air smelled of dust and stale coffee. He slept for hours, not comfort. Woke before dawn, lines in hand, again. The man who once earned $20 million per film was now rebuilding himself piece by piece, paycheck by paycheck. The world laughed, headlines mocked, memes replaced respect, but he didn't stop. "Pain shows you things applause never will," he said later. "It shows you who you are, when no one's there to see it." And slowly and almost invisibly, something shifted. The calls came back, not for the icon, but for the man underneath it. Joe, Mandy, Pig, performances stripped of noise, built from something quieter and far more honest. Each role felt less like a comeback and more like a reckoning, a refusal to disappear. The fire returned, not explosive, but controlled, clean, real. Looking back, he didn't curse the collapse. He understood it. "Maybe I had to lose everything," he reflected. "It's hard to remember why I started. Because somewhere along the way, the work had been buried under the weight of everything else. And when that weight was gone, something clearer remained. No castles, no noise, no illusion, just truth. And sometimes that's the only thing that survives the fire. Not what you built, not what you owned, but what you were always meant to become." Money wasn't the only thing he was losing. Some losses ran far deeper. In the late 1980s, before the fame hardened everything, there was Christina Fulton. Not a headline, not a storm, just a presence. Steady, warm, real. Around her, the noise faded. For the first time in years, Nicolas Cage didn't feel like he had to perform. He could just exist. And in that quiet space, something inside him softened. They were young, restless, and certain life was still theirs to shape. Mornings carried the smell of coffee and baby powder. She would hum softly in the kitchen while he read scripts out loud, turning their small living room into a stage only they believed in. Nights stretched into long drives down Sunset Boulevard. Neon lights passing like promises, stopping at diners where conversations lasted longer than the food. Then, and in December 1990, everything changed. Their son, Weston Coppola Cage, was born, and for a moment, everything slowed. He held the child carefully, almost afraid to move, as if something this real might disappear if he wasn't gentle enough. "For the first time," he once said, his voice quieter than usual, "I had something that didn't vanish when the scene ended." Friends noticed it, the way he spoke, the way he looked at his son, grounded, present, almost peaceful. Their home filled with lullabies, scripts, unfinished dreams, a fragile balance between art and family. But fame doesn't wait. It pulls, it demands, and slowly it took more than it gave. One film became two, then three. Cities changed, time blurred. Suitcases stayed half-packed by the door, like something permanent. Christina stayed, raising their son, rebuilding a life that required presence. Nicolas moved from set to set, from role to role, chasing something that never stayed still. Conversations became messages, good nights became recordings, and without either of them noticing the exact moment, warmth turned into distance. Not anger, not betrayal, just absence. By the mid-1990s, they weren't fighting. They were simply no longer reaching each other. Love didn't break, it thinned, until there was nothing left to hold it together. Years later, when asked about that chapter, he didn't justify it. He didn't rewrite it. He just paused. "I was there for the work," he said quietly, "but I should have been there for them." No drama, no defense, just truth arriving late. And sometimes on nights when the city feels slower than it used to, he drives past an old diner on Sunset, the kind of place where time used to stretch and laughter came easily. The lights are dimmer now, the voice is gone. But for a second, something returns. Not the past, but the feeling of it. And he allows himself a small smile. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it mattered. Because maybe love isn't something you keep. Maybe it's something that changes you and stays long after everything else is gone. Peace can be more dangerous than chaos because it makes you believe the storm is over. For Nicolas Cage, that fragile calm arrived in the early 1990s, and it had a name: Kristen Zhang. At the time, Hollywood was already turning toward him. Magazine covers, flashing cameras, roles stacking into something unstoppable. But when he met her, the noise receded. She didn't see the rising star, the headlines, or the intensity that defined him on screen. She saw the quieter man beneath it, the one who lingered over sunsets on Mulholland Drive, who stopped to pet stray dogs between takes, who longed for stillness but had never truly learned how to live inside it. She brought a kind of calm into my life, he would later reflect, something I didn't even realize I was missing. Their love carried a rare kind of balance, not dramatic, not chaotic, but almost too gentle for the life surrounding them. He was instinct, impulse, extremes. She was grounding, rhythm, restraint. Somehow they met in between. Candle-lit dinners stretched into soft conversations, laughter that felt like relief rather than performance. Nights that ended not in headlines but in quiet dreams shared between two people trying to believe in something lasting. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't proving anything. He was simply there, home in a way he had never quite known before. When he proposed, it came with the same intensity he brought to everything: bold, unfiltered, certain. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, violins moving gently through the air. As the room fell still, he knelt, steady on the outside, but with something fragile beneath it. She said yes. And for a brief moment, even a city built on noise seemed to pause. But some stories are not meant to stay still. Just weeks before the wedding, the past returned. Not quietly, but with a force he hadn't prepared for. Patricia Arquette, a name that wasn't just memory, but unfinished emotion, something he had once chased for nearly a decade and never truly let go. What had been buried didn't stay buried. It reignited. And in that moment, the calm he had built with Kristen began to fracture from within. She didn't need explanations. She saw it. In the hesitation, in the shift, in the space between words. Because sometimes love doesn't end in conflict. It ends in realization. She left without noise, without accusation, leaving behind only the ring, a perfect circle that suddenly felt too fragile to carry what was coming. No bitterness. No spectacle, just two people stepping away from something that no longer belonged to both of them. Years later, he didn't rewrite that chapter. He didn't defend it. He only said quietly, "She was the piece I didn't know how to keep." And maybe that's what she remained. Not a regret, but a reflection. A moment in his life where everything slowed down just long enough for him to see who he could have been. Because not every love is meant to last. Some arrive to show you a different version of yourself and leave before you learn how to hold on to it. And when Nicolas Cage opened his heart again, it would no longer be for peace. It would be for something far more dangerous. Love doesn't always return to complete you. Sometimes, it comes back to finish what it started. Just weeks before his wedding to Kristen Zhang, Nicolas Cage saw her again, Patricia Arquette. Not a coincidence, a collision. The room shifted, sound dulled, conversations blurred into nothing. Because this wasn't temptation, it was history reopening. The woman he had chased across years, across reason, across the thin line between devotion and obsession. The one story he had never been able to close. 1987. Cantor's Deli, Los Angeles. Neon humming overhead. She was 20, luminous, untouchable. He was 23, restless, reckless, believing intensity could bend reality. Within hours, he told her he would marry her. She didn't reject him. She challenged him. A black orchid, J.D. Salinger's signature, a frozen figure from the Himalayas. Impossible things, spoken lightly, but he didn't hear a joke. He heard direction. Years followed, chasing symbols, chasing meaning, chasing something he couldn't name. She became my North Star, he would later say, quieter now. Not just her, but what she represented. Time passed. He learned to live without her, or thought he had, until she stood there again, just before a different future was about to begin. and everything shifted back. They married soon after. And for a brief, dangerous moment, it felt like destiny had corrected itself. Nights stretched into highways, headlights slicing through desert darkness, voices rising with old songs only they remembered. Mornings were softer, coffee, poetry, fragments of quiet that felt earned. They moved like two forces that understood each other too well. It didn't feel normal, he once admitted. It felt inevitable. But intensity doesn't stabilize, it accelerates. Slowly the distance began, not from lack of love, but from too much of it, burning without balance. Film sets replaced presence, calls replaced conversations, absence became routine. We loved the idea of what we were, Patricia would later say, and Cage, years after, didn't argue. It burned, he said, and when something burns that hard, it doesn't leave much behind. By 2000, the warmth had thinned. By 2001, it ended. Not with anger, but with exhaustion. A suitcase left near the door. A room still lit, but empty. 6 years on paper, less than one in reality. No children, no scandal. Just two people stepping away from something they once believed could outlast everything. Years later, when her name surfaced again, his voice would change, not broken, but altered. She was a storm, he said once, and some storms, they don't pass. They stay somewhere in you. He didn't run from that memory. He carried it into every role, into every silence, into every version of himself that followed. Because some loves don't end. They embed. They reshape how you feel, how you trust, how you return. Patricia Arquette didn't just mark a chapter in his life. She defined a threshold between who he was before and who he had to become after. And maybe that's the truth most people don't want to face. The love that changes you the most is rarely the one that stays. Some loves don't arrive to save you. They arrive to finish what the last heartbreak began. Barely a year after the collapse of his marriage to Patricia Arquette, Nicolas Cage found himself standing at another emotional crossroads. And then came a name the world already carried like legend: Lisa Marie Presley. To everyone else, she was Elvis's daughter. To him, she was something quieter, more human. A woman carrying grief, expectation, and a loneliness that mirrored his own. "I didn't marry Lisa because of who her father was," he would later say, measured, almost protective. "I married her because I loved her." They met in 2000, at a time when fame had lost its meaning and solitude had become unbearable. She was living in the shadow of a king. He was trying to escape the weight of becoming one. And in that fragile intersection, may something real seem possible. The kind of connection that feels like rescue, just before it becomes ruin. Their beginning felt almost cinematic in its softness. He read poetry beneath open skies. She played Elvis records that filled the silence with something inherited, something sacred. Nights drifted between yachts and quiet conversations. Mornings felt slower, almost grounded. "It felt like breathing again," he once confided to a friend. For a moment, the chaos that had defined both their lives seemed to loosen its grip. They married in August 2002, a small ceremony, intimate, but impossible to hide from the world. Headlines exploded, cameras chased them, two legacies colliding. But behind the spectacle, something delicate struggled to hold. They weren't building from peace, they were building from fragments. Or from wounds that hadn't fully healed. And cracks don't need time, they need pressure. It unraveled quickly, not from lack of feeling, but from too much of it. Pride, intensity, impulse. One moment warmth, the next fracture. Arguments rose and vanished like storms that left damage behind. And then came the night that would outlive the marriage itself. A bridge, yellow light. Words that cut deeper than either intended. In a surge that wasn't anger, but something heavier. Exhaustion, grief, realization. Cage pulled off his wedding ring and threw it into the river. $65,000 reduced to a single sound against water. Final. It wasn't rage, someone close to them would later say. It was heartbreak moving through him. The next morning, divers searched. They found nothing. And maybe that was the truth of it. Some things once lost are not meant to return. Not everything is meant to be recovered, Cage reflected years later. They tried again briefly, drawn back by something they couldn't control. But by November, it was over. 109 days. No scandal, no betrayal. Just two people who reached for something too fast, too deeply, and watched it collapse in their hands. Afterward, he didn't defend it. He didn't explain it. He carried it. She would later admit, "We were both searching for something we had already lost." And for him, the loss wasn't reputation or pride. It was the disappearance of something that almost felt like redemption. Sometimes on sets near water, he would pause, not speaking, not moving, just watching the surface ripple outward. A crew member once said, "It was like he was listening for something sinking." Maybe he was, because that ring didn't just vanish into a river. It marked a moment when hope slipped beneath reach. Years later, when asked what remained from that love, he answered slowly, "Some things aren't meant to stay. They're meant to leave a weight behind." And maybe that was her role in his life. Not to last, but to remind him that even the fiercest hearts can crave stillness, and that some kinds of love don't break you loudly. They stay with you, quietly, long after everything else is gone. Not every love arrives like fire. Some come as quiet relief after everything inside you has already burned. Less than 2 years after the ring disappeared beneath dark water, Nicolas Cage wasn't searching anymore. The noise of his past had worn him down to something simpler, more fragile. And then in a small sushi restaurant in Los Angeles, no cameras, no headlines, no spectacle, something shifted. He was 40, carrying exhaustion behind his eyes. She was 20, a waitress named Alice Kim, steady, unassuming, present in a way that didn't demand anything from him. There was no performance in that moment, no myth, just a man ordering food, and a woman who saw him without the weight of everything he had been. "She came when I needed something different," he would later say, quieter than before. Not intensity, just peace. And for the first time in years, peace didn't feel like absence. It felt like survival. What followed didn't look like the life he had built before, and that was the point. They married in 2004, ignoring the noise around them, the headlines about age, the doubt from the outside. For him, it wasn't controversy, it was grounding. The castles faded, the chaos receded. Life became smaller and more real. Home-cooked meals, long drives with no destination, evenings spent watching old films instead of becoming them. When their son was born in 2005, he named him Kal-El, not as a gesture of spectacle, but as a quiet declaration that something broken could begin again. Friends noticed the shift immediately. He wasn't chasing anymore. He was present, feeding his son at sunrise, writing notes in the kitchen, living in moments instead of headlines. She made it safe for him to be still, someone close to him once shared. And for a man who had lived in extremes, that stillness wasn't emptiness, it was balance. But life doesn't stop testing what finally feels stable. The industry moved on. The fortune collapsed under the weight of debt and excess. The empire he built began to disappear piece by piece. Homes, collections, illusions. There was nowhere left to hide behind success. And yet she stayed. Through ridicule, through headlines that reduced him to failure, through the long, quiet rebuilding no one applauded. "We'll get through this," she would tell him, not as reassurance, but as fact. For 12 years, she wasn't just his partner. She was his center when everything else fell apart. And when everything else disappeared, he once admitted, she didn't. But even the strongest anchors can loosen over time, not from conflict, but from change. The world slowed, the urgency faded, and in that quiet distance began to grow. Subtle, unspoken, irreversible. By 2016, they separated without spectacle. No blame, no damage, just two people who had reached different versions of themselves. "She was my best friend," he said later. "We just didn't grow in the same direction." Years later, he still speaks of her without bitterness, not as someone he lost, but as someone who arrived exactly when he needed to be held together. And maybe that's the truth few people admit. Not every love is meant to stay. Some are meant to steady you long enough so you don't fall apart completely. When asked what that chapter meant, he didn't reach for something dramatic. He just smiled, faint but certain. She came when I needed peace, he said, and somehow that was enough. Because sometimes the most important love in your life isn't the one that lasts. It's the one that quietly saves you and then lets you go. Emptiness doesn't always arrive as a collapse. Sometimes it returns as a quiet weight you thought you had already survived. 3 years after Alice stepped out of his life, Nicolas Cage kept moving, but something in him had stopped. Not broken, just untethered. The man who once found peace now woke up to its absence. The industry slowed around him, the lights dimmed, but it wasn't Hollywood that changed. It was him. After 12 years, he once admitted, voice low, almost reluctant, you forget how to exist on your own. So he kept going. Film sets, flights, hotel rooms that all felt the same. Anything to outrun the echo waiting at night, because loneliness doesn't need to chase you, it waits where you stop. And when that weight becomes unbearable, even clarity can start to blur. For him, it led to Las Vegas, 2019. When a night stretched too far, too much alcohol, too many memories, too little distance from everything he had been carrying, the city flickered around him like a hallucination. Neon, laughter, noise. All of it loud enough to drown out thought, but not feeling. Somewhere in that haze, he met Erica Koika, a makeup artist. Warm, spontaneous, present in a way that felt like relief in that moment. Not love, not meaning, just interruption. And sometimes that's all a person reaches for. A moment that doesn't belong to the past. They married quickly, almost impulsively, the kind of decision that doesn't come from clarity, but from fatigue. Not a beginning, a reaction. 4 days later, it ended. Headlines spread faster than truth ever could. The world laughed. The story became a spectacle. But behind that noise, and there was something far less dramatic. Just a man facing himself. He filed for annulment, stating simply, I wasn't in a clear state of mind. Not justification, recognition. Because sometimes the breaking point doesn't look like destruction. It looks like a small, irreversible choice made at the wrong moment. That brief marriage wasn't about love. It was about exhaustion reaching its limit. Years later, when asked, he didn't resist the narrative. He didn't correct it. He just said quietly, it was a mistake, but maybe I needed to see it. No defense, no denial, just awareness. Because what that moment revealed wasn't recklessness, it was weariness. The kind that builds slowly, invisibly, until even silence feels too heavy to carry. That chapter, as brief as it was, he held something honest, that even those who have lived through everything can still lose their footing for a moment. And sometimes that moment isn't a fall, it's a reminder, not of failure, but of limits. Nicolas Cage didn't lose himself in Las Vegas. He found the edge of how far he could go without losing everything. And in that realization, something shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but enough. Because the truth is, you don't always rise after falling. Sometimes you rise after realizing you don't want to fall any further. 56 years in, and the weight of a lifetime doesn't fade. It settles deeper, quieter, until even peace feels unfamiliar. By 2020, Nicolas Cage had lived through more extremes than most ever will. Fame that roared, losses that hollowed, love that burned and vanished. Yet beneath it all, something remained unresolved. Not chaos, not ambition, a longing, steady, patient, almost invisible. And halfway across the world, in a quiet Japanese gallery, where footsteps echoed softly against polished floors, that longing finally found shape. Her name was Riko Shibata, 26, composed, unassuming, with a stillness that didn't demand attention, but held it. He was there between film shoots, carrying the residue of decades. She was there simply to look at art. We met by chance, he would later say, pausing slightly. But it felt like something was finally aligned. For a man who had spent a lifetime chasing intensity, The absence of it felt almost unfamiliar, and exactly right. What began wasn't dramatic, and that was the difference. No headlines, no urgency, just time unfolding at its own pace. Walks without destination, meals without distraction, conversations that didn't need to impress. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing. Not for a role, not for the world, not even for himself. And in that space, something inside him began to settle. "She listens," he once said quietly, almost surprised by it. And somehow, that makes everything else quieter too. In her presence, the past didn't disappear. It simply stopped echoing. In 2021, they married at the Wynn Hotel in Las Vegas, a ceremony stripped of spectacle, it defined instead by intention. The date was chosen with care, February 16th, his father's birthday. "It felt like a blessing," he said, his voice softer than usual, like he was still part of it. For someone who had lived at the edges of everything, the simplicity of that moment wasn't small. It was sacred. Then came something even quieter and far more permanent. In September 2022, their daughter August Francesca was born, a name that carried both memory and renewal. And with her, something shifted completely. The man who once measured life in premieres and paychecks now found meaning in mornings. Early light through the window, a small hand reaching out, laughter filling spaces that once held only silence. Friends noticed the change. Not dramatic, but unmistakable. He moved slower, spoke softer, stayed present. "In this time," he said once watching her play, "it feels different. Like I understand what matters." There were no castles anymore, no excess, just a home filled with ordinary moments. Cooking, reading, quiet conversations that didn't need to go anywhere. "After everything," he reflected, "I realized peace isn't something you find. It's something you allow." And for the first time, he did. Now, when he looks back, it isn't with regret, but recognition. Every fracture, every mistake, every fire he once couldn't control, all of it led here. When asked if he still believed in love, he didn't hesitate. He just smiled. Not the smile of a man chasing something, but of one who had finally stopped. "I do," he said, "but it's not loud anymore. It doesn't have to be. Because after a lifetime of storms, when Nicolas Cage didn't find peace by escaping the fire, he found it by learning how to live without being consumed by it." And maybe that's the quiet truth his life leaves behind. Not every ending needs applause. Some endings arrive as stillness. And in that stillness, for the first time, nothing is missing. In 2026, at 62, Nicolas Cage no longer balances on the edge of excess. He lives within a discipline carved out of everything he once lost. After watching tens of millions slip through his hands during one of Hollywood's most public financial collapses, he rebuilt himself piece by piece, not through luck, but through relentless output. Over 30 films across a decade, from studio work to independent projects that restored both credibility and cash flow. His net worth today is estimated between $25 and $40 million, a fraction of what he once held, yet far more stable. But the transformation is deeper than numbers. Where money once fueled identity, it now serves structure. He has traded spectacle for sustainability, a shift visible in how and where he lives. His primary residence in Las Vegas, valued around $7 to $10 million, is a modern, low-profile estate tucked behind gated privacy, with clean architectural lines, open-plan living spaces, floor-to-ceiling glass, and controlled natural light designed not to impress, but to calm. Secondary properties in quieter California coastal areas, modest by celebrity standards, roughly $3 to $5 million each, prioritize proximity to nature, intimacy, and livability. Gone are the castles with echoing halls, and the island that once isolated him from reality. What remains are homes that hold life, not legacy. At some point, he reflected, you realize ownership can become a burden if you don't know when to stop. What he once owned reads like mythology now. A $10 million medieval castle in Somerset with stone corridors and centuries-old silence. A private Bahamian island bought for roughly $3 million, where even the ocean felt distant, a Gothic mansion in New Orleans filled with ornate ironwork and shadowed rooms. At his peak, he held more than 15 properties worldwide, many acquired not out of need but momentum. When the collapse came, tax lay-ins, forced sales, assets liquidated under pressure, those places disappeared one after another, not gradually but decisively. Today, his approach is surgical. Fewer properties, each chosen with intention, manageable square footage, lower maintenance, environments built for family presence rather than display. The same recalibration extends to his vehicles. Once the owner of a multi-million-dollar fleet, Ferraris including models valued well above $300,000, Rolls-Royces exceeding $400,000, rare collector cars, he has since reduced his collection to a handful of functional, performance-driven choices. A Porsche for precision, a classic American muscle car for familiarity, machines meant to be driven, not stored. The philosophy has inverted completely, not accumulation, but control, not rarity, but relevance. More than anything, he rebuilt financially. What defines this chapter is where he chose to invest emotionally. With Rico Shibata, his life has shifted into something almost unrecognizable compared to his earlier decades. Structured, present, grounded. Their daughter, August Francesca, born in 2022, has quietly become the axis around which everything else turns. Mornings are no longer rushed departures for film sets across continents, but slow routines. Breakfast prepared at home, time measured not in contracts but in moments. He has spoken openly about how fatherhood now feels different, more deliberate, more aware. His son Weston, now an adult, continues to pursue music and acting, navigating his own complex path with both talent and volatility. Cage remains present without imposing, a shift from ambition to guidance. "Annie, I think I finally understand what it means to show up," he said in reflection, not as a statement, but as recognition. That awareness, earned through distance, not given, defines the man he has become. Time has left its mark, but not in ways that diminish him. The intensity is still there, sharpened by experience rather than driven by impulse. His physical routine is measured. Light strength training, controlled diet, consistency over extremes. A quiet investment in longevity. There are no major public health crises attached to his name, but like many who have lived at emotional extremes, he carries something less visible: accumulated fatigue, reflection, the weight of memory that doesn't fade, only settles. His charitable contributions, though rarely publicized, span decades. Millions directed toward humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and cultural preservation. Professionally, he stands in one of the most respected phases of his career. Performances in Pig, the unbearable weight of massive talent and dream scenario have reframed him. No longer the unpredictable spectacle, but a disciplined, introspective actor choosing roles with intent. He still works consistently, but no longer out of urgency. Each project now feels considered, almost personal. What ultimately sets Nicolas Cage apart is not the scale of what he built, but the clarity of what he rebuilt after losing it. He has lived through extremes most people only imagine: wealth beyond reason, collapse under scrutiny, love that burned too fast, solitude that lingered too long. And yet what remains is not bitterness, but refinement. His life no longer chases noise. It protects meaning. If there is something to take from his journey, it is this: the real measure of a life is not how high it rises, but how honestly it rebuilds when everything falls apart. That is the lesson his story leaves behind. Not loud, not immediate, but undeniable. So if you've ever faced loss, failure, or the quiet fear of starting over, consider this. Not as inspiration, but as evidence. Reinvention is not reserved for the extraordinary. It belongs to anyone willing to begin again, without illusion, without excess, and without giving up on what still matters.